Hey,
Hey, Pierre, how's it going today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good.
Can you hear and see me okay?
Yeah, yeah. Are you
Okay,
able to hear
cool.
me?
Yeah, most
Cool.
definitely. How you
All right,
doing?
well, looks like we've got a lot of people joining in here.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah,
Excellent. All right. I'm looking
yeah.
forward to
So,
this.
so, yeah, let's touch on for me, I really wanted to chat about mental health and labels. I think for me, the reason why I think it's important is are people using labels and throwing out names. It's almost a form of bullying, but I think there's a deeper issue where I don't think everyone appreciates or fully understands even the meaning behind a label. And it could be potentially a behavior or a trait someone's displaying, which doesn't necessarily means that they're a certain label. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, for sure. I think that I think increasingly there are a lot of terms that are being thrown around, perhaps with some awareness in some cases, but a lot of times with sort of a loose appreciation for what those labels actually mean and entail.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And I think it's becoming an issue within society because I see it quite frequently. And some of the terms I wanted to touch on, like the ones that I hear quite a bit, are specifically around gaslighting and narcissism. Yeah, you got that, yeah, smile on your
The
face.
smile on my face with narcissism. Yeah, that's an important one. I mean, I think as someone who has uh, hmm, who's seen the term be thrown around fairly often and also experienced a fair bit of personal and professional interactions with people who do experience and have a predominance of narcissistic personality features, I am both cognizant of the desire not to overuse the term and also um, perhaps sympathetic to those who might actually be in close relationship to someone with pathological narcissism. And so there's value, I think, on both fronts to being really clear about what those terms actually mean. And
Mhm.
there's certainly some overlap between the behaviors that are commonly called gaslighting and narcissistic personality or even narcissism on the whole. And just uh, to be upfront and something I think that we'll touch upon even more, all of these sort of personality disorders that are commonly described, they'll include bits and pieces of personality features and traits that
Mhm.
are common perhaps to all of us. And
Yeah,
so any one of us at any point can show up with some element of narcissism, whether or not it's a predominance, it's something that's pervasive and persistent. I think that's really what differentiates whether someone has character pathology or not.
right.
Yeah.
Yes. No, and I think part of it is also, I was having another conversation last week. It's also where you fall on the spectrum, right? So that in itself can be a challenge when you say something like that or use that label. It's like, do I still have you there, Pierre? Oh, looks like we lost Pierre. Let's bring him back.
Now you do.
Yeah, there we
Okay,
go.
cool. Sorry about that.
No, no worries. Yeah, so I was kind of talking about being on the spectrum as
Yeah,
well, right? And
yeah.
like, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but can you maybe, try to, like, let's explore what it means. Like, I think it's fairly complex in terms of what narcissism is, but I personally struggle with it. Like, I would struggle with even calling someone that without fully knowing what the term means. But I also am studying psychology, so I guess I have a bit of an appreciation of what it means to be on a spectrum, and you know, how certain behaviors don't necessarily lead to a diagnosis, right?
Yeah. So that's a solid point, and I would say um, the sort of the framework of the diagnosis would involve um, a an inflexible, persistent pattern that is pervasive throughout all elements of life. So many of us might experience elements of narcissism in one aspect of our lives, or at one point in our lives that might be related to a specific personal challenge, or a moment of stressor, or perhaps even a period of changes to mood or anxiety. But people who actually have narcissistic personality uh, have it over many different areas of life, over years and years. Largely, it's an inflexible pattern. It's maladaptive. It doesn't necessarily serve them, and certainly doesn't necessarily serve their relationships, whether they be personal relationships or professional ones.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of it impacts, I'd say, believe the estimate's about 1% of the population. Men are slightly uh, more likely to show narcissistic personality features than women, although a lot of the research around character pathology has suggested that within a cluster of personality disorders like borderline or histrionic or antisocial or sociopathic personality, that men tend to be clustered more in the narcissistic and antisocial personality, which is really more sociopathic and not necessarily antisocial in the way that many of us use the term um, more sort of colloquially, and that women might be more likely to be classified as having histrionic or borderline personality disorder, even if men and women will show up with the same features. So it
Mm-hmm.
becomes really kind of complicated sometimes to differentiate the two, but we're talking about something that impacts about 1% of the population.
Right.
And it's really this pattern of grandiosity, an exaggerated sense of self-importance, rather than sort of a strong sense of ego and self-identity that we might associate with people who are very self-confident. Um, People who show with narcissistic traits tend to desire excessive amounts of admiration, feel like they've been dealt an unjust hand if they fail to achieve success. There's a lot of externalization
Mm-hmm.
and manipulation in order to abuse power. And there's a weak or fragile sense of self, as opposed to people who may have a sort of stronger sense of self-confidence. We think often of people with narcissistic personality as people who are very likely to get insulted or have their ego wounded by a
Mm-hmm.
perceived slight.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily what you think of when you think of people who are really self-confident.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I think it's important to touch on, I mean, based on even what you've kind of talked about there, it is fairly complex, right? And to your
Yeah.
point earlier, I think most of us at some point, what I mean, whether it's day to day or even occasionally, we will display those behaviors.
Totally.
Doesn't mean we're narcissistic. And I think the other piece is the lack of empathy, right?
That's big. Yeah.
The lack of empathy is huge. So I think, and it was funny, like when I was talking to my therapist, we were just having this conversation around narcissism too. She said often people will kind of use it as a, you know, if I'm setting boundaries, firm boundaries with other people, they may call me that because they're obviously not liking the fact that I'm setting boundaries and I'm trying to
Yeah.
protect myself. So that was kind of an interesting perspective on it. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Uh, Yeah, there's a big difference between setting firm boundaries, having the sense of self-awareness and sense of prioritizing your own needs that may underlie creating healthy relationships. There's a big difference between that and narcissistic behavior that is lacking in empathy. And I think to your point, the the setting of boundaries when they're respectful of your needs and the needs of another person um, are inherently uh, not lacking in empathy. It's really when your behavior to set boundaries with other people becomes dismissive or even unsupportive or harmful to other people's
Mm-hmm.
needs,
Right.
that it becomes really pathologic in the sort of narcissistic um, in the narcissistic maladaptive way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so setting your own boundaries isn't necessarily like that's not really narcissism, but it is identification of your own self needs, which
Yep.
is important and I think often undervalued.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is quite conflicting, right? I mean, you hear the message of choose yourself, be kind to yourself, love yourself. And then when you kind of do that, often people are offended and saying, oh, this guy's like high on himself, like
Yeah.
puts himself first. And it's, I mean, with anything, there's a fine balance, right? There's a fine line,
Mhm.
and you have to teeter that line quite often. But at the same time, you have to realize that any choice you make in life, there's going to be people who are not going to be happy with that. So,
Yeah.
um, so even within that, if you start kind of taking that fear of not being liked away, I think there's also that component where other people may accuse you of being narcissistic, right? I could see
The
the
fear of
danger
not being
there.
liked. I
Yeah.
could see that. Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose uh, with people who do have really pathologic narcissism, where it's inflexible, it's a part of you. If you create a boundary and it's somehow questioned by another person, then the likelihood is in those moments, especially if people have really sort of malicious narcissistic traits, uh, is then to use sort of um, manipulation or even gaslighting, which I think we'll
Yeah.
talk about at some point,
Yeah.
to sort of squash those boundaries and those needs.
Yeah.
I'd say if you think let's say, another person's boundaries are somehow self-indulgent or excessively needy for the self, and you name it, usually if that person is going to maintain some empathy towards you and sort of and potentially compromise or at least hear you out,
Mm-hmm.
uh, what you're not dealing with is sort of the malicious type of narcissistic personality where those needs are squashed altogether or
Mm-hmm.
they're undermined.
Yeah.
And so more often, the lack of empathy is what differentiates perhaps like transient narcissistic traits, which we all have. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
all
Mm-hmm.
of the sort of personality features that are identified in all of the different personality disorders, they're natural and human. It's really just when they become so maladaptive and persistent that they start hurting, especially other people,
Mm-hmm.
that you can start to sort of throw around labels. And I think that's why generally it's not advisable to throw around labels unless you're really proficient in the study and the knowledge of character pathology. And I would say that's very few of us, even those of
Right.
us within mental health
Yeah.
fields are really reluctant um, to prematurely name someone or declare someone as having a personality disorder because it taints the way that we look at how they may show up. It limits
Yep.
the sort of appreciation for their own humanity. And
Yeah.
so I would say like it's probably generally not that great an idea to sort of throw around terms like that.
Right. No, absolutely. And I want to
Yeah.
expand on three things you kind of mentioned. The
Yeah.
first one is obviously, like you said, um, maybe calling the behavior out or the action out rather than labeling, right? But even when you do call that behavior out in a very healthy, constructive way where you could say, hey, when you did this, this is how I felt. I think there's, to your point there, if the other person has empathy, they can at least understand that point of view as opposed to just going out and labeling someone. That can also cause like defensiveness and you're basically, I think you're creating a situation or you're creating something huge out of really nothing in terms of just by
Yeah.
identifying the behavior. I think the other piece, even like to your point of using these terms, whether we are proficient or not, I think unless it's unless I'm like soliciting that kind of feedback or I'm asking for a diagnosis, I don't think any one of us really want to be called anything unless we're going to
Yeah.
see a mental health specialist or an expert to be diagnosed. So I think that's something to be mindful of as well, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I
Yeah.
mean, calling the behaviors out is one thing, but sort of throwing out a term that will undermine the rest of your the legitimacy of your decisions and your actions is another thing altogether. And so I think to your point, you're absolutely right. There's very little value in naming someone as uh, anything really, um, in lieu of calling out perhaps the behaviors and uh, how you respond yourself to those behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the third thing is like our perspective is often like, I mean, limited, right? Like if I'm
Yeah.
experiencing something, my opinion immediately is biased. So, it's often important to get an objective view, but also, kind of holding yourself accountable to understand, okay, well, I'm experiencing this for a certain reason, but is this like, is this the truth? Like, is this how others would experience it? Or maybe I need to expand my view and my perspective before I even, start making claims or labeling someone.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good point.
Yeah, and I think the third, I mean, another piece you touched on, gaslighting. That's a huge one. I mean, that that one gets thrown around a lot too, and I think almost in a way, it's a manipulative tactic where if you call someone, if I accuse another person and say they're gaslighting me, immediately they're on either the defense or I've thrown them off because I've essentially accuse them of emotional abuse.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know what your thoughts on that gaslighting stuff is because it drives me nuts.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of behaviors labeled as gaslighting, and sometimes it makes sense, I suppose, that it is, but I sort of see gaslighting as uh, kind of what I suppose to your point, also once you throw it out there, it sort of like it undermines anything that comes next, and
Hmm.
so it becomes near impossible to have a conversation that is uh, really bi-directional once you're accused of gaslighting. But I mean, the way that I see it is when someone tries to sort of make someone else question reality or their judgment by calling them perhaps overly sensitive or making a huge deal. I mean, in essence, what is happening is the opinion of the other person is being undermined.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so
Or
I
or
guess,
their
yeah,
reality is being questioned, right? So if
yeah,
I'm to tell you, hey, Pierre, you know, this is what you did, or this is how I felt about it, and you completely deny it, or you say, nope, it didn't happen that way, Now
Yep.
you've started questioning my reality or what I perceived of a
Yeah.
situation.
And so it sort of rejects everything else that comes thereafter.
Yeah.
And I guess that's probably the fundamental takeaway from uh, the concern that you've addressed here around labeling. That once someone is labeled as something, it becomes impossible almost to restructure or to flex your appreciation of how that person actually shows up. And it's rare that people are going to show up in a strictly uniform way that somehow undermines consistently and tries to hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
It happens, and so I don't mean to diminish it by any
Right.
stretch. I mean, I think as someone who's had plenty of personal relationships, familial friend relationships with people with fairly substantial character pathology, uh, I would say I would be sort of foolish to assume that something will change in the individuals I know who've treated me in a particular way or treated the world in a particular way, um, just because I'm trying to sort of maintain a positive viewpoint around them. That said, it's exceedingly rare that that is the case unless you know someone for a lifetime and you're familiar with patterns of behavior. And even then, the clear majority of us, even though we'll demonstrate or we'll show up with periods of uh, wanting to be sort of on our own or sort of schizoid, wanting to sort of show up in the best possible light, showcase our egos in the best possible ways. We may show up with narcissistic traits or tendencies at particular moments. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, at least for the majority of us, around 99% of us, if we just look at the population statistics around narcissistic personality, if we're just looking at that one,
Yeah.
the clear majority of us aren't going to show up in ways that are strictly, concretely, inflexibly narcissistic.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think going back to the gaslighting piece, I mean, we kind of touched on it, but you're basically, by throwing it out there, you're completely shutting down the conversation. You're undermining the other person, and now the other person either has to like defend themselves, or they have to stop talking about whatever they're talking about because they're fearing that, oh, I'm gaslighting, and it takes away from the opportunity from the other person, even if they're whatever they wanted to talk about is legitimate. Now you've created this barrier to the communication, and I think the theme of this conversation really has been maybe calling out the instance, or trying to understand what the other person's saying and avoid the labeling, which I think has become, and you and I've chatted about it offline, but a huge issue in our society. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on what you're seeing in whether the people you're working with, um, or even around you in social situations.
Yeah. Um, I think um, what I've often seen is, I suppose, both ends. Uh, People who've been accused of showing up in a narcissistic fashion or showing up as gaslighting in some way, or people who've potentially been victims thereof. But I suppose, really strongly to your point, it does throw off the conversation, um, and it limits the capacity to have interactions where both parties can appreciate one another more strongly. So I find myself, when I hear those terms being used, really digging deep into what the meaning is behind them, or what the perceived meaning is behind them, and then perhaps breaking it down to the lowest, the sort of um, the 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 smallest sort of part that can
Hmm.
actually be articulated in a way that might sort of violate someone's values or someone's needs in the moment. And so if um, what you identify in a partner or in a work colleague as narcissistic or as gaslighting may be effectively undermining what's important to you, then articulating it as such will often help to allow that person to communicate that feeling without putting the other person on the defensive. And I would say in a lot of my work,
Hmm.
uh, even just like the focus of mitigating um, defensive, like mitigating the language or changing the language that would make people feel like they're put on the defensive is so big,
Yeah.
because we can't really have these interactions in an open, agreeable kind of a way if each person is throwing out terminology that's really charged.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I think more than anything, I find, regardless of whether someone is coming in having been on the receiving end or being accused of any of these sort of labels, getting clear on what that actually means and then communicating it in a non-defensive way is really becomes sort of the first step to appreciating or the first step to in helping people to engage in conversations with other people.
Right.
Now, oftentimes, even when that non-defensive sort of level of communication is brought out, if someone is actually gaslighting you or someone is really sort of manipulating you in a narcissistic way, um, the oh, I think you that sort of allows for an extra bit of data, because if you're coming at it from a non-defensive way and the other person is attacking you, despite your being non-defensive, that might be an indicator that that the other person might actually be trying to manipulate you in some way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, I mean, to kind of highlight that, what you're getting at is, I mean, ultimately the responsibility is with both people,
Yeah.
especially if you're in a conversation, right? Like for the first person not to necessarily label or attack, and maybe just identify the behavior or the situation itself. But then on the other end, it's also an opportunity for the other person to perhaps not get defensive and seek out, so even if the other person's attacking them, but maybe try to understand, okay, well, what's the situation here? Let me understand better. When did I do something that could have come across as whether it was gaslighting or narcissistic? And I think just having that openness and humility, and curiosity, I think kind of basically puts the other person's accusation, you basically defeat that, or not undermine it, but you're kind of opening yourself up to get more information, which I think that in itself shows that you're not necessarily uh, being narcissistic or even trying to gaslight.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's a good point. In many ways, too, there is an element of the accusation then creating defenses or defensiveness that might show up in a particular way that only might reinforce this idea that I'm being gaslit or
Hmm.
the person I'm dealing with has no empathy,
Right.
when in fact it's your own stuff. It's
Yeah.
perhaps your own like style of communication. I mean,
Absolutely.
and it's a and that's and it's fair. And I think especially when you are dealing with elements of narcissism, there are times in which experiences become projected. Experiences that are sort of uh, internal thoughts or impulses or beliefs about um, that are coming from within about the world around you are sort of um, are misinterpreted as coming from the outside inward. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's not uncommon that that level of defensiveness um, will then only push people to act in a way as to sort of fulfill your preconceived notion of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
think it's also noticing why you may be getting triggered in a given situation, right? And it might not, it probably most of the time has nothing to do with the other person. It's really something you need to look inward to understand, okay, why am I being triggered? It's probably not this person being a narcissist. It's probably something inside of me that's coming up and I need to get curious with it or understand, right? I mean, obviously it's hard to do in the moment, but I think for people, it's an opportunity to look at inward and understand what's going on. Maybe it's something from the past that's coming up, or yeah, it's something you haven't dealt with.
Mhm. That's fair. That's
Yeah,
important.
yeah. But I mean, I want to tie all of this back now to kind of from a men's mental health perspective. And, it's really important that we talk about vulnerability and we ask men to show up and have these open conversations and express themselves. But at the same time, there's a fear that I can appreciate where you may be worried about saying something that you're feeling or trying to express something to someone and have that fear that you may get called a narcissist or get told that you're gaslighting in that situation.
Yeah,
Um, so
there
yeah,
is.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I think to that's true, I suppose, to both extremes. There is also this sense too that if you express vulnerability and you're showing some perceived sense of weakness, that you may be called out as weak,
hmm,
um, or unmanly in some way. And so, yeah, there is a sense. I mean, and it's true, I'd say, certainly true for men across the board, certainly in the West. There's all sorts of implicit and explicit um, stories and norms around what it means to be a man, and
yep,
also perhaps what it means to be a good man. And so, um, with so much sort of squishy terminology kind of thrown
yeah,
around what that actually means, um, it becomes really easy to violate these really traditional norms. And I would say you're absolutely right. I think more often than not, I think about the violating norms in the sort of with the concern of being called weak. But you can also sort of then extend that concern to being called aggressive or toxic or
yeah,
narcissistic. And
yeah,
so, yeah, I mean, like without a clear appreciation for the values in any given moment and the context, um, there's fear. There's the fear that your your experience in a moment will somehow reflect how someone sees you more persistently and pervasively throughout your life.
yeah, yeah. Or your experience may get undermined, right?
Yeah.
And I can appreciate that fear because, like say if I'm taking that leap and opening up, whether it's with a partner or a friend, and I get told I'm gaslighting, guess what? I'm going to think twice about even saying something next time, right?
Yeah.
So I think and we've touched on this before, but the responsibility it lies with everyone involved in a given situation where if one person's opening up, and again, maybe identifying certain things that were said or done, avoiding the labeling, but also like giving that person some form of appreciation for being vulnerable.
Yeah. Most certainly. And it's sort of the quickest way uh, to losing a client or losing a friend.
Yeah.
To sort of make someone feel undermined to a point of non-importance, or even sort of like to sort of undermine the value of their thoughts or feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, that's
yeah,
I mean, I'm trying to think of how do you kind of navigate that moving forward, and like how do you, I don't want to say educate, but how do you like work with people in identifying this as an issue, and recognizing how harmful it can be.
yeah. Well, I think it probably. I'm curious about your thoughts on this too, but I think it's really about, in part, avoiding sort of modeling and avoiding the improper use of labels and conclusions that are jumped to on our end, but calling it out when we might be seeing it in people, and that can be like, that can be uncomfortable. It can be even quite courageous to bring it up when people, especially friends or family members, or superiors, bring up these kind of labels that are undermining in some way, that are really not helpful, um, to get curious about what they actually mean.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say throughout all of this, curiosity is probably the biggest, um, the quickest resolve to overcoming misused labels. Getting curious about what someone actually means when someone uses a label, even identifying then how that made them feel, them, like what the personal response and reaction
Yep.
is to that experience, um, allows for exploring uh, into the depths of those labels, so that the labels themselves can be questioned, sometimes thrown out, sometimes affirmed. There is value in some cases to being clear on how someone is showing up, so that you avoid being the victim of consistent manipulation or lack of empathy. But I think that starts with just getting curious about what people mean when they actually use these terms. And
Right.
I'd say toxic is probably the one that like strikes me as the most heavily used without a clear, consistent meaning. And
Right.
so it can then really set people on the defensive when it's used. And so, yeah, I generally find myself getting really curious about what people mean when they actually use these terms, and then breaking it down to the smallest common parts.
Yeah. No, I agree 100%. I think that the curiosity is important. Um, but at the same time, I think it's also, I mean, it's hard. It's easier said than done to be like, hey, just be curious, right? And I think
Yeah,
it's important to recognize that if the other person is labeling you, I mean, it's easy to take it personally, but at the same time, it's also excusing that in itself and saying, okay, well, what does that mean for them? What's going on for them, for them to label me, without fully understanding the situation. I think the piece of advice I have for people if they're going to resort to labeling is don't rely on a Google search. And the other thing is, chances are, if you're going to go tell a narcissist that they're being narcissistic, they won't care. So don't even waste your energy, because again, the differentiation I look at is the lack of empathy.
yeah,
So, and if you're going to label someone else as a narcissist, you're also kind of attacking them, and that in itself is a form of abuse in my mind. So now you're no better than the other person, whereas you can deal with it in a healthy way, and try to have an open and honest conversation without resorting to the labeling. But again, often uh, you get caught up in that moment, and don't pause and reflect and say whatever comes to your mind. So just being aware of that, I think, is probably the most important thing I can share.
Yeah, Furkhan, I think that's a super valuable point. For most people with actually pathologic narcissistic character, the level of insight is really poor. So naming someone as a or labeling someone as a narcissist directly probably in most cases isn't going to actually fall upon, like, it's going to fall on deaf ears.
Yeah, exactly.
um, and if anything, it will invite some potential injury, sort of narcissistic injury, where there's a perceived or disproportionate threat that then leads to a degree of anger and manipulation. And so, unfortunately, it's meant in my life that people I've known who have really demonstrated pretty consistent tendencies toward narcissism have been sort of like, I've had to just sort of distance myself slowly, consistently, setting up firm boundaries. Um, and the level of conversation, the back and forth sort of bidirectionality of conversation is in most cases not possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are having a conversation with someone and you call them a narcissist and they actually start to become curious about what you mean and empathic towards you and want to change and um, and not want to sort of harm you or manipulate you um, or try to overpower you in some meaningful way, you're probably not dealing with someone with narcissistic
Mm-hmm.
personality disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can apply the same logic to gaslighting, right? If you're going to
Mm-hmm.
call out someone who's truly gaslighting you and manipulating you, chances are they're going to turn it around on you. And
Yeah.
you've basically, again, not really created any positive value out of doing that. So I think it's, again, being aware of those labels and not relying on certain meanings that you find online, and you're applying it to your unique perspective in a situation that you're potentially biased in. So again, that's where I kind of, that's how I look at least. I could be wrong, but for me, it's like, again, recognizing that my view is limited. I only have part of the story, and that story is just my version, and my opinion on it is biased. So when you get it down to that level of detail, you can appreciate how your view is so limited, and you just approaching it and kind of using a generalized term is probably not accurate in that situation.
Yeah. Strong point. And I'd
Yeah.
say even in the standpoint um, of how mental health professionals might use certainly uh, certainly the declaration of character pathology or personality disorders, there's a really strong tendency to avoid premature naming of character pathology, such that even in the moment, if someone is suffering from like a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder and it's an acute episode, a lot of those features might overlap with some of the character traits that we see in the many different personality disorders.
Yep.
And so there's a really strong um, push and bias towards avoiding the premature diagnosis of personality disorders, even when we see people over long stretches, weeks or months at a time, when they're suffering from an acute stressor or an acute episode of a mental health disorder, um, to not label. And so I think that underscores the importance of not jumping to conclusions for people in our lives when we're outside of that setting, when we're
Yeah.
not seeing people for years decades on end. It's really not, we're really not taught to make these diagnoses outside of moments in which we're able to see people across different domains of their lives, across different stages of their lives, when they're not suffering from acute stressors. Because it is those moments when we're suffering from acute stressors or we're feeling somehow somehow constrained, not spacious, not able to sort of make to freely move about in our relationships or even in our personal sort of fulfillment of values, that these features will emerge. Doesn't
Yep.
necessarily mean that like that we have a personality disorder.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's important you touch on that because you're right. I mean, we're not often we don't have the luxury of seeing people in the various domains, right, of their life. Often it's an isolated situation. And then the other piece is the people that do diagnose are neutral parties in a way, right?
Yeah.
They're not. They have like, I mean, I don't want to see no skin in the game, but there's no emotional involvement from that perspective, and I think just to kind of give perspective, when you look at the DSM-5 and you look at all the traits that go into any personality disorder, and I just want to highlight this again, you could easily sit there and identify with so many of those traits as an individual. So I think it just gives you some sort of like appreciation when you go through those traits that, oh, I could be classified as this, right? And it might give you some compassion for people that you may want to label in your life.
Yeah, most certainly. Most
Yeah.
certainly.
Pierre, this is all the time we've got, but I think this was
Cool.
great. We should probably do another one.
Yeah.
And you know, if people that have been watching, if you've got feedback for Pierre or myself, please reach out to us. If there's topics that I think people want to hear, I think we can easily do that as well, right, Pierre?
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be
Hey,
great. We have a whole like all the layers of toxic to go through that
yes.
I think we can go through on a different line. But we'd definitely be open to ideas about what you'd like to hear more about. Thank you,
Yeah.
Furkhan, for setting this up.
No, thank you for making the
Yeah,
time.
man.
And you're right. I think toxic is a huge one that we
Oh
probably have
man.
to set aside another day. uh,
Another hour.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, man. It's good to
All right.
see you.
Likewise. All right. Take care,
All
man.
right. Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.